In preparing for a CASPer test, it can be really useful to go over practice questions and think through the kinds of answers that you might give to those questions, but it can also be really useful to take a bit of a step back and look at the bigger picture. And by that, I mean looking at the types or categories of CASPer questions that are frequently encountered. And so that's what I'm going to discuss in this video today. 3 key categories of CASPer question that you absolutely have to be familiar with as you approach the test. First, hi, my name is Dr. Sarah Klebe, and I'm an admissions expert at BeMo. So there are lots of different possible CASPer test question categories. We've actually been able to identify 21 different categories, and if you want to check those out, you can look at our book that we've published on improving your CASPer score, our ultimate guide to CASPer, which I'll link in the comments. But it's possible for me to give you a few of the most common kinds of CASPer question or CASPer question category that you might encounter, so that you're familiar with the kinds of steps that you're going to have to take and the most common kinds of categories that you might encounter. So the first is probably the biggest CASPer question type, CASPer question category, and that is the classic ethical dilemma. And several of the categories that I'm going to go through today are going to have ethics sort of at their core or as part of their overall sort of scope of things that you really need to consider. But the ethical dilemma is such that it deserves a category all its own. So ethical dilemmas are always those kinds of questions or scenarios that require you to make a choice, and a choice that's often going to directly impact others, usually in the form of potentially harming them or not harming them, allowing harm to come to them or protecting them from harm, or violating the moral and ethical standards of someone else. You may also find yourself having to deal with multiple competing ethical priorities, and maybe even looking at that question and going, wow, there is really no good outcome that I can see. There is no way for me to successfully maintain everyone's ethical convictions, including, my own, because your own ethical convictions are at play here as well. So these are incredibly tricky, and they sometimes are, if not no-win situations, situations in which there isn't going to be necessarily an ideal outcome. The classic sort of ethical dilemma is the scenario where you're a physician in an emergency room and a patient comes in who is a minor. This person has a massive blood loss of some kind that has to be stopped, and a transfusion is necessary for this person to continue living. And you find a recently signed Jehovah's Witness card in their purse or wallet. So here you're faced with this dilemma, this tension between your own ethical duty to save a life versus your ethical duty to a patient and their moral, ethical convictions, their religious beliefs, things that make up the core of their own ethical perspective of themselves and the world. So this is a notoriously difficult dilemma. We've talked about this scenario in other videos. You can see a lot of discussion of this particular ethical dilemma. Anytime also that maybe you're having to stand up to an authority or a colleague who's behaving inappropriately, or even reporting ethically questionable behavior of someone that you respect or that you trust or that you have a personal relationship with, that's going going to be or constitute an ethical dilemma as well, right? Your ability to stand up for what you think is right, to justify that belief of ethical correctness, and your ability to do so even at times when maybe it is uncomfortable for you, right? So respecting the beliefs of a Jehovah's Witness that requires a blood transfusion is something that a lot of people who aren't themselves Jehovah's Witnesses have a hard time reconciling when there's a life on the line. And so demonstrating how you're going to carefully think through that scenario, how you're going to balance these competing concerns is incredibly important. And so the best thing that you can do here to approach these ethical dilemmas is to simply make yourself familiar with the ethical standards of your field and work on your own ethical reflection on these issues. And not just work on your own sort of reflection, but work on demonstrating that reflection so that your motives are clear for others. These aren't always questions with a clear yes or no answer. There isn't always one good option or one path that you have to take. They are just as interested in seeing how you navigate this situation. Are there other options available to you that aren't expressly stated in the scenario itself? One of the sort of classics in terms of that Jehovah's Witness question is there are substitutes now, synthetic options for people who require blood transfusions who can't have literal actual blood transfusions because of their religious or ethical beliefs. So spending some time with classic ethical dilemmas and looking at the ways in which these have been sort of wrestled with by others in your field or in the field that you're aspiring to join is a great way of, number one, thinking through these very real problems that you may face someday as a professional, and therefore, refining your own sense of ethics in the world. And then also, consequently, of course, coming up with some solid answers in a CASPer test. So category number 2 is the category of professional boundaries. So professional boundaries are essentially these invisible barriers that exist between professionals, their clients, their students, their patients, and the wider public. These kinds of boundaries exist to protect essentially parties on both sides of that boundary. Often, people in power and people who are, operating under those with power. So professional boundaries exist to ensure that those power dynamics aren't exploited and that everyone is treated respectfully and appropriately. So if you were to get a scenario, for example, in which someone in a superior position is having relations with someone who is subordinate to them, so a doctor with a patient, a professor with a student, that would be an issue of professional boundaries. So again, what's important here is, number one, to be aware of what the professional boundaries and expectations are in your field, and to always maintain that idea of the power imbalance and demonstrate that you understand why those professional boundaries exist. So this again requires some research and exploration on your part to understand what the professional limitations are in the field that you're aspiring to join, and understanding why they exist, why these are so important, why it's such a big deal, for example, when news breaks on campus that a professor has been having a romantic relationship with one of their students, right? A lot of people might say, well, they're both consenting adults, and as long as the student is over 18 and all of that, I don't really see what the problem is. But the problem is precisely that power imbalance, and again, the fact that those professional boundaries exist to protect both parties. They exist to protect the student in this case and the professor, just as they exist to protect doctors and patients in terms of doctors and patients having romantic relationships and things like that. So anytime you are given a scenario where someone is going against those boundaries, you again want to demonstrate that you understand what those boundaries are, why they exist, and that you would be willing, to stand up for, to intervene on behalf of the person in the position of less power. And then the third category of CASPer question that I'll give you today is the conflict of interest. So a conflict of interest exists anytime someone acts in their own interest, to their own benefit, over and above their duties and responsibilities to others. So these are very easily observable in things like business relationships. Again, a sort of classic scenario would be a physician receiving gifts from a pharmaceutical representative, which could represent a conflict of interest. It's possible that those kinds of gifts could ultimately influence the physician in terms of which medications they prescribe, showing favoritism towards a particular pharmaceutical manufacturer and their drugs over and above others, which isn't necessarily in the best interest of patients, nor is it in line, again, with those sort of ethical or even legal boundaries established around the practice of medicine and prescribing drugs. But if a person is acting so that they are sort of benefiting over and above their responsibilities to others, that's a potential conflict of interest. If there's someone who's trying to personally profit out of a professional arrangement, or using that arrangement to benefit others in a way that isn't ethical, that could be a conflict of interest as well. So again, you need to be able to demonstrate not only that you're able to recognize these situations and avoid acting out of your own self-interest, putting the needs of others in your profession above your own desire for personal gain, but also that you would be willing to intervene when others engage in conflict of interest, when they seek to benefit themselves, when they should be serving others. So stepping in when you see classmates cheating or plagiarizing, being able to say that you would take action when someone who is your superior is making questionable choices, ensuring others aren't profiting from the work of others. These are all key moves that you want to demonstrate when a conflict of interest is at play. So again, take some time in your preparation to explore the conflicts of interest that are out there and that are common in your profession, and do some honest reflection on how you would deal with these kinds of situations, why the standards exist as they do, who they're seeking to protect, what they're seeking to avoid, and make sure that you're being honest in those reflections and that you're able to articulate that honest reflection. You want to, in any of these responses, make sure that you are being authentic, not just saying what you think the evaluators want to hear, because again, there isn't always one good, single, correct answer to these questions. They are dilemmas and challenges and sort of perennial issues because of the fact that they're so complex and so common. And the ways in which we respond to these things now may change in the future depending on how our ethics within our profession change. I don't think they'll become more lax. If anything, they'll become more strict and stringent over time. But the point is that kind of authentic reflection is incredibly valuable in responding to CASPer type questions and things like that. You don't want to just robotically parrot a generic response. That's really easy for evaluators to spot, even in CASPer where you're typing out your answers. They can tell if you're just kind of regurgitating things that you read elsewhere. So the larger lesson here is become familiar with the standards and with the common dilemmas, conflicts, boundaries in the profession that you are working towards, and think honestly weigh a variety of perspectives, look up a variety of different possible responses and positions, and figure out where you stand and how you can ethically, professionally, personally justify that particular stance. So you can obviously reflect on the tips that we offer you. I'll make sure to put some links in the description below with to various blogs that we have that help you deal with exactly these kinds of questions, including some sample CASPer questions and expert answers, responses, reflections, etc. As well, you can, of course, check out our book, Our Ultimate Guide to CASPer Prep, which I'll also link below. And as ever, I hope that you enjoyed this video, that it was helpful and helped you think through these really challenging categories of CASPer questions. If you did enjoy it, please do go ahead, like it, share it with a friend who might benefit from it. Be sure to follow us on whatever social media platform you are on right now. If you'd like us to help you with your prep, click the link that should appear either above or below this video to see our programs and schedule your free initial consultation. We'll set you up with our admissions experts to answer any questions you might have and get you started with your preparation. We have programs to suit any of your needs, and we're always happy to work with you to determine which plan is going to support you and your goals most effectively. As ever, thank you so very much for your time. Take good care, and I'll see you next time.